The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again here at Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and we're talking more baseball today. And God, I love this period of baseball. We're talking Depression-era baseball, and we're talking specifically about the 1933 New York Giants. And we got author Lou Hernandez on the show today, and he'll be discussing the whole mystique of the post-John McGraw era, and we're going to talk about the first All-Star game that was also included in that year. And, Lou does a great job, telling us what was going on, like King Kong was in the theaters at the time. He mentions Footlight Parade, and I love Footlight Parade. That's with character actor Jimmy Cagney, and if you don't know who Jimmy Cagney is, he's probably my favorite movie star of all time. He played usually a tough guy, a gangster. But if you ever seen Yankee Doodle Dandy, if you've ever seen other movies by him, I think The Seven Little Fauntleroys in the 1950s, he reprises his role as George M. Cohan, and he's tap dancing with Bob Hope on the table. You could also see him in other films. When interviewed in the late 70s, Jimmy Cagney said there was two things that he, crafted his mantra, and one of them was boxing, because boxing, you make a quick buck, and two was dancing. And so he made a living throughout the 1930s and 40s doing the whole gangster bit and being a tough guy, and he made a living, being probably one of the best hoofers I've ever seen. And I was fascinated to see that Footlight Parade was in this wonderfully written book. And we'll get to the book, and we'll get to Lou in about 2 minutes, but you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. There's a lot of baseball out there. Houston and Los Angeles are going to the World Series. They beat my Yankees the other night, and so my wife is a lot happy that I can come to bed now and watch movies with her rather than stay out and see if the Yankees are going to win. So being up here in Boston, as I always say, and being one of the few lone Yankee fans in Red Sox Nation, I get a lot of lips. So, but, that's baseball, that's life. I'll be watching the World Series probably from my bed and with the, I don't even watch baseball. I listen to it. I like it better on the radio. I'm an old-timer. And, people say, well, you're only 47. I said, yeah, but you know what? If you go to my website, Broadcasting Baseball, on Facebook, you'll see that radio, to me, is probably the best way to listen to a game. But we have a lot of great shows. We have Bill Kashatis. He's out in Philadelphia doing the whole Philadelphia past, present, future. We're not only talking about the Phillies, we talk about the Stars, and, of course, those great athletic teams under Connie Mack, who subsequently in his book, again, 1933, focusing on two great teams in the American League at the time, and, again, the Yankees, who overthrew the Giants pretty much in the 1920s as the king of New Yorkers. And we're talking about Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's, who won 3 pennants in a row. So, the 1933 World Series, again, the Giants were in the National League, and of all teams, Joe Cronin and the Washington Senators. And there was a good book I read years ago, The Wrecking Crew of 33, and that was a great book on the Washington Senators. It talks a lot about Joe. And, of course, this is the team that they played, the New York Giants. We're going to talk about Bill Terry. We're going to be talking about the handing off of the baton between John McGraw and Bill Terry, and how Bill Terry really wasn't John McGraw's first pick to be the manager of the 32 Giants. And it's an interesting story. Mr. Hernandez's book is going to be coming out on McGraw and all this other stuff. We're going to do an inquiry a little bit about McGraw, and it's just a fascinating book. Also, during the time, again, time of Depression, you had Prohibition going on still. It was finally repealed that year. President Roosevelt, he became the president. Of course, he shut down the banks for 100 days, and he tried to start something to get the nation going. In the American League, there was a marathon going on at Griffith Stadium. The Washington Senators, who went to the World Series, and the Indians both combined to break a major league record by using 11 different pitches in 12 innings, with both bullpens depleted, the Senators finally broke through the stalemate for an 11-10 decision. Jimmy Fox hit for the cycle against the Cleveland Indians again. Connie Mack's wondrous A's on August 14th. And New York Yankees icon Babe Ruth returned to the mound on October 1st to pitch the final outing of his career. That's right. A lot of people don't know that. In the National League, Honus Wagner, he retired years ago. He came back for Pittsburgh as a coach on March 11th. Now listen to this. We had an earthquake that rocked the Los Angeles area, interrupting the exhibition game between the Cubs and these New York Giants. And, of course, the Philadelphia Phillies, Dick Bartell, equaled a Major League mark on April 25th with 4 doubles in 4 at-bats during a 7-1 victory over the Braves at the Baker Bowl. And that, again, is in Philadelphia. And it wasn't such a great park as I understood it, but Commissioner Landis took a voluntary pay cut of 40%, set an example for the league-wide salary cuts that were anticipated due to the lingering depression. I mentioned the All-Star game, and we had a wonderful World Series, although, the Giants won it, but just getting there was half the fun. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Lou.
Thank you, Ian. I'm pleased to be with you.
I'm pleased to be with you, too. I hope I didn't butcher things too much for 1933. But,
no, you capitalized it great.
The 1933 was a banner year. As a young kid, I grew up in New York City. So to see the Empire State Building in its infancy with King Kong climbing it up and those old airplanes from the World War I shooting them down, you take pride saying, wow, you're a kid. He climbed that. The monkey climbed the Empire State Building, got shot. But again, back then I wasn't even alive, and neither were you. But you had the New York Giants. You had the New York Yankees. And let me ask you this about McGraw. McGraw was in baseball for 30 years. Well, he was in longer. He played in the Baltimore Orioles in the 1890s. But he managed the Giants after that rift with Van Johnson back in 1902, where he defected to go to the New York Giants. Now he's getting older, and he's not really that old. He's only 60 years old, and he's passing the baton to Bill Terry. What was going on with that?
Yes, McGraw's health finally caught up with him, and that's what caused him to eventually step down as manager of the Giants. That's what it was.
Let me ask you this, Lou. I know you're coming out with a book about McGraw, like we spoke earlier and before the show. McGraw's from the old timers, even predating the dead ball. He played in the 1890s where, again, you barely had any baseball gloves. You used to threaten the umpire with knives and run after him. Guys used to run around the bases, and the fielders were allowed to grab his belt, stick their legs out, and all this. And the dead ball style of play, it was a lot of bunting. It was a lot more strategy. And then you have the live ball. Now, he did win 2 World Series in the live ball, but in my opinion, they were still playing a dead ball kind of game until 1923 when the Yankees beat the Giants and overthrew the Giants. That literally left a hole till up around this time. Do you think McGraw was well suited for the live ball era?
I think as a manager, he would have adapted, and he was, I think, starting to adapt. He didn't bunt a lot despite the period of time he was managing. But I think it depended on his players. Obviously, if he'd had power hitters, I think he would have adopted the strategy more of scoring more runs rather than, the big inning rather than bunting and sacrificing for 1 or 2 runs here and there. I think he would have adapted, but again, towards the end of his career, it's just his health deteriorated, and he missed a lot of games in the late 20s and early 30s before he retired.
Now, let me ask you this. A lot of the stuff I read, because let's face it, McGraw was the king of New York. When you talk about McGraw, you're talking about a status here that's probably, eclipses any of the current managers that we have, or even Joe Torre, or even Tony La Russa, and all the winning this match. We're talking about an icon, a pioneer, just like Connie Mack, in their different eras and styles of play. So let me ask you this about McGraw. he was the king. And what I've read was he hated Babe Ruth because Babe Ruth totally transformed the game. Did you read anything about that?
Yeah, initially to your point about McGraw's reputation, it was enormous. In fact, before McGraw came along, I write in my McGraw book that John McGraw's name was the most recognized name in baseball. And he did not initially like Babe Ruth. Didn't like, I guess, maybe some of it had to do with envy because Ruth was getting all the attention with his home runs. But initially, it's true. He did not like McGraw. I've read many notes, many books, and many articles that confirm that.
Yeah, and McGraw wasn't an easy guy to get along with. Whereas Connie Mack was very soft-spoken. He was the tall tactician. McGraw, he was a drinker, he was a brawler. He let you know about it. He had his gambling casino. Didn't he have gambling casinos? Speaking of Spanish Caribbean, down in Cuba and stuff like that.
He owned with the owner of the Giants, Stoneham. He owned Oriental Park in Havana. But shortly after Commissioner Landis came to power in 1920-21, Landis made McGraw and Stoneham give up their interest in that horse racing track, which also, as you mentioned, did have a casino, a side casino there where you could gamble.
And Hot Springs in Arkansas was one of the places a lot of these teams used to practice. I forget if the New York Giants practiced their pre the winter ball there. I don't know. Did you read anything regarding that? Because that was just full of prostitutes and gambling and everything else going on in that city.
Yeah, actually, McGraw found Hot Springs when it was in its incipience, and he brought the Giants down there for several spring trainings in a row. But when it became more popular as far as a health type of resorts, more people started going down there. It became more commercialized. And you're right, when that happened, McGraw thought it was too much of a diversion for his team to concentrate on the upcoming season, and he moved to Florida for spring training.
Yeah, Hot Springs, people don't realize that early baseball wasn't the kind of spring training that we get today with all this conditioning. You go down there, you're playing baseball for about 2 hours, and you're partying the next 22 hours. Booze, women, gambling, those hot springs, which is supposed to replenish these senses. Almost like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, actually, down in Warm Springs. He thought those waters, those warm waters of the springs down there were very therapeutic to polio victims, and of course he opened a camp down there for kids as well. Let me ask you this about McGraw and Terry. How did these two get along? Because Terry was on the team for a while.
Yeah, they didn't get along. In fact, Terry's biographer, Joe Williams, said that they didn't speak to each other, off the field for years and years. When they got between the lines, they were professional and everything, but they did not get along at all. In fact, Terry said that the day McGraw asked him to take over as manager, McGraw called Terry into McGraw's office, and Terry thought he was going to be traded.
That's right. He didn't know what to do it. He was actually shocked that he was going down and so much pressure being built on him. Not only that, but again, when just to highlight McGraw's role as king, not only in New York but king of baseball. When he died the year after, he died in 1934, I believe. Lou Gehrig hit 4 home runs that day, and McGraw's death eclipsed that as the headlines in the New York papers. That's how much McGraw. This is the kind of shoes that Bill Terry is filling in New York.
Yeah, it was actually the day after McGraw's announced resignation. That was in 1932 when Gehrig hit those 4 home runs. And you're right, McGraw capitalized or he monopolized, I should say, the headlines in most newspapers across the country, and Gehrig's 4 home runs were reduced to smaller column space.
Now let me ask you this: When I read your book, I was very, very shocked to find out Bill Terry wasn't his choice. He was influenced by Charles Stoneham, to pick Terry. My question is, the thing with McGraw is he's bigger than life. He has clout over owners and all this. Why didn't he assert his foot forward for his predecessor?
Yeah, that story came from Terry himself, that Terry wasn't McGraw's first choice, and that the choice was for manager to succeed McGraw came from Stoneham, and Stoneham, of course, was the owner, and he had the final say. Maybe it speaks to McGraw's, I guess, lack of control by that time, or waning control. He was a huge man and a huge name in the game, and maybe by that time, Stoneham was able to stand up more to him than maybe 10 years earlier or something like that. But that story is originated from Terry himself, that McGraw, or Terry, was not McGraw's first choice for manager.
What do you think? Research.
Yeah, I think probably McGraw. I don't know who else he could have picked. There was complaints that Lindstrom was supposed to be the one that took over for McGraw, that there was an agreement between McGraw and Lindstrom that he would take over. In fact, that led to Lindstrom being traded the previous year by Terry. Lindstrom asked for that trade once Terry was appointed manager. Terry and McGraw didn't get along, so I can understand why McGraw may not have wanted Terry to succeed him. Again, we have to rely on what Terry said, and I think most writers of the time, went by that first-hand account. McGraw never really said directly that I wanted this person or that person. It was Freddie Lindstrom that said that McGraw had told him that he was going to be the manager of the Giants once McGraw stepped down.
Now let me ask this about McGraw. Do you think even in the latter years as a Giants manager, his tactics, his strategy was still as effective, say, 10, 15 years before? Because Bill Terry inherits a team now. And again, in 1932 he finished the season. 1933, hey, this is the new era that's beginning. Do you think McGraw's effectiveness lasted well into the early 30s?
Well, I think your point may be well taken. The game may have started at least to pass McGraw by. But again, it's hard to say, because McGraw, again, in the late 20s, early 30s, his health was deteriorating, and I write about that in my McGraw book. And he missed a lot of games from the bench, games that are recorded in his favor, and that's one thing I'm going to try and bring to light, that McGraw actually managed fewer games than official records give him credit for.
Really? That's fantastic. I wonder why they did that again. And record keeping in those years were pretty well. I mean, in 1878, you could go back to then. Records were pretty much well taken. Let me tell you something. You didn't need someone to, add on to this guy's legacy. I mean, how tall was McGraw? 5'5", 5'6"?
Yeah, I think he reached 5'6". I think online some of his personal data shows 5'7", but 5'6", 5'7" max. But he was a firebrand of a ball player, that's for sure. He made his ball player, and then he had one of the greatest career moves in baseball history when he came over to the Giants and New York, I should say, and took over the Giants, and he made them the most recognizable franchise in baseball until the Yankees usurped that from him starting in the 1920s and, of course, later through the decades. And,
I did a lot of research on the whole Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker affair in 1927 and 1926. Do you know, I don't know if you found this, do you know McGraw, when the whole thing was going through and they weren't even acquitted yet by Judge Landis, McGraw wanted Cobb on the Giants. He wanted to move Ty Cobb from the American League to the Giants. He went after him.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he went after him, and what happened here was, again, you're going back to a game 7 years earlier, and you might want to add this before the final publishing. If you look at the historical records, in November that year, as soon as Cobb resigned, he had this huge fallout with Frank Navin. And at the time, a lot of people didn't know that American League Ban Johnson, who, again, he battled with McGraw after the left. They hated each other, and that's well documented. But he sought Ty Cobb, and he was going to pay him an exorbitant amount of money to come to the National League. But what McGraw didn't know, what a lot of American Leaguers people knew, was that Landis was going to dig Ban Johnson's final grave and pin him into the nail and finally seize total power after all these years, and he would not let Ty Cobb go because Johnson said Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker will never play another game in the American League as long as I am president, and no matter what Commissioner Landis rules. And he told McGraw, go get lost, Landis told him. And they're not switching leagues. And when it came down and the American League lost faith in Ban Johnson, Landis says they will stay in the American League and they're free for any American League teams to be picked up. And that's where Connie Mack came in. He became a Philadelphia Athletic. And Tris went to Washington with Griffith for a year, and then he ended up going to Mack the year before. But that's what happened. And McGraw, and you should do some research on it because that's fascinating. He tried to lure Ty Cobb to the National League. And back then, again, they were like different, operations. You had to get permission from the presidents of each league if you wanted to transfer leagues, and it was this whole administrative nightmare. But I found that fascinating about McGraw.
Yeah, I got to be honest with you, Ian, that's news to me. I didn't come across any of that during the 1926 season when I was writing the McGraw book. But you are correct about McGraw and Johnson. They really butted heads. Johnson suspended McGraw several times when he was with the Orioles in the American League, and they really had an acrimonious relationship. And yeah, it's not surprising that Johnson would never or do everything he could to prevent Ty Cobb from going to the rival league, especially to McGraw's team. Yeah, I'm surprised. That's news, and I'm glad to hear something. I will look into that.
You can read my book next year when I get to publish. McFarland is digging into it, but I love this era of baseball. And like I told you before, I have my master's in history. But I write a very obscure thing, just like you wrote on the 1933 Giants. It's like, okay, the 1933 Giants, well, they beat Washington, but when people look at it, I mean, they beat the Yankees, Washington, for 7 games. They won 99 games that year. This is a team that went to the World Series in 1924. I think they beat the Giants in 24, didn't they?
I think it was Pittsburgh, wasn't it? Didn't they win against Pittsburgh? Or was that 25?
And that was 25. Pittsburgh beat Washington, I think. Yeah, and then 26, Pittsburgh beat the Yankees on that. Babe Ruth was thrown out for stealing second of all things to end the World Series. And then in 27, the Yankees beat Pittsburgh. But I forget. Actually, no, the 26 was the St. Louis Cardinals. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sometimes I'm going... I'm getting old. I'm getting Alzheimer's. But what kind of team did Bill Terry inherit for the 1933 season?
Well, Terry inherited a team that had finished next to last in 1932. They tied the Cardinals, I believe, in 1932. And so he did not inherit a very good team. The Giants weren't a good team from the late 1920s to the early 30s. And I think Terry's greatest virtue when he came with the Giants was that he brought a more relaxed clubhouse atmosphere. He did not rule with an iron fist like his predecessor McGraw did. He didn't have any curfew for the players like McGraw did, and he let the boys be men, so to speak. But Terry also won in '33 with a rookie shortstop, which is pretty unusual. And as far as his position players, he remolded that team, and he turned over 50% of the 1932 club to the 1933 club. The position players, 4 out of the 8 position players that were on 32 were no longer with the team in 33, and he started by making some trades. One where he took over in June 1932. He brought up JoJo Moore from the Giants Farm Club in Jersey City and placed him as his starting left fielder. Obviously, Terry saw something in Moore that McGraw hadn't seen. Moore gets a lot of credit for being a great defensive left fielder, especially at the Polo Grounds, which had a very tough sun field. And Terry didn't stop there. He didn't sit on his hands, in other words, when he became manager in 1932. He decided to refit the team, and he went about doing that. He added depth to the team. He brought on Bernie James in September of '32, a utility player, but still players you need. Championship teams need quality depth, as you know. He purchased Paul Richards from Minneapolis in the American Association for cash. Richards became the backup catcher. He also got Howard Peel from the St. Louis Cardinals as a Rule 5 draftee the same month of September 1932. And then he started with some really key trades right after the season, and perhaps his biggest trade or his key trade occurred in October of '32. He traded 4 players to the St. Louis Cardinals for Gus Mancuso and Ray Starr. Now, Gus Mancuso became the Giants' starting catcher and one of the key players of the team as far as handling one of the best pitching staffs, or statistically the best pitching staff of the National League that year. Terry traded 2 starting pitchers who were past their prime, Jim Mooney and Bill Walker, in that trade. And that also freed the starting staff to bring up Roy Parmalee, and Hal Schumacher, who had breakout years in 1933 for the Giants. And as I mentioned earlier, he traded Freddie Lindstrom. Lindstrom, again, was upset about not being named Giants manager, and he asked Terry for a trade, which is something Lindstrom in years to come said he regretted. But Terry traded Lindstrom to Philadelphia, and he picked up a pitcher named Glenn Spencer and Kiddo Davis, and Davis ended up being the starting center fielder for the 33 Giants. And in two days later, Terry obtained Blondie Ryan, who ended up being the starting shortstop for the Giants the whole year. Terry did that because Travis Jackson, had problems with his knees, and he was kind of suspect for the 1933 season. He had both knees operated on in 1932. So Terry, looking ahead, was a very prudent move of his, and it really paid off. Blondie Ryan was a tremendous defensive player. He also had a key hit in one of the World Series games for the Giants, and Terry's last trade was 2 days before the end of the year, when he traded the Giants starting catcher Shanty Hogan, which goes to prove when Terry made the original trade for Mancuso that he had intended Mancuso to be the Giants starting catcher. He traded Shanty Hogan to the Boston Braves, and he received no players, but he got $25,000 in cash, which was a pretty astute deal. So we're talking Davis in center, JoJo Moore in left, Blondie Ryan in center. Blondie Ryan at short, and Mancuso behind the plate. That's 4 players of the previous starting 8 that were not with the team in 1932, but were important ingredients to the 1933 team. And that was all Bill Terry with his moves behind the scenes. Now, that having said, McGraw did leave Mr. Terry with some good pitching, and Terry capitalized on that. And if you want, you could ask me about that, or I can keep going. It's up to you.
Well, before we even get to the I love it. I loved your answer. Before we get to the meal ticket, Carl Hubbard, which unbelievable season, and he led the staff. Let's get to Mel Ott, because Mel Ott is one of these guys that are so overlooking by historians. The guy hit 511 home runs, for God's sakes. He wasn't even tall, and he didn't even look that heavy like these guys today. They're all jacked up, the steroids era. These guys were big. Mel Ott was a little thing playing right field. What was his influence on all the new people coming in?
Well, I'm sure he had, as a veteran, I'm sure he had a steadying effect. As you said, he was a quiet superstar. I guess that's the best way to describe him. He's a southern gentleman type of figure. And as you said, he didn't cut a big swath with his height. I think he was 5'9", if I'm not mistaken.
Hey, yeah, he was.
Yeah, he had an extraordinary batting stance and leg kick that he just, as the pitcher was delivering, he lifted his legs so. I'm sure your listeners have seen photos or even maybe old footage. He lifted his leg high into the air as a timing mechanism. And with that, he was able to generate a lot of force in his swing, and he was very well suited for the Polo Grounds and the short porch there in the right field. But yeah, he's a very deserved Hall of Famer. Didn't get a lot of headlines because, again, he wasn't the gregarious type that the New York writers like to write about. But certainly his numbers spoke for themselves, and they spoke loudly enough to get him to deservedly so, into the Hall of Fame.
And, let's get to the pitching, because Carl Hubbard, a meal ticket, whatever, King Carl, whatever you want to call him, what was his career before this point? And what was he? He was like 20-something years old, I think, at the time. He was pretty young on this team. And what was going on with him that year?
Yeah, actually, Hubble turned 30 that year. So he had been in the league about 5 or 6 years. McGraw signed him. It was a regrettable deal for the Detroit Tigers because they had him in their farm system. But Hubble always complained that the Tigers, and you mentioned Ty Cobb earlier. Ty Cobb was a manager one of the years that Hubble was under contract with the Tigers, and Hubble, I don't know if it was sour grapes or what, but Hubble said that the Tigers didn't even give him a chance to show what he could do, and that to the benefit of New York Giants fans was a big history change. McGraw signed him, and 1933 was Hubble's career year. The year before, he had good years. I think 18 wins was his best before 1933. In 1933, he just had one of the best years of the whole decade of any starting pitcher. He won 23 games to start with, and he led both leagues in ERA in 1.66. He had 10 shutouts that year, 10, which was a record for left-handed pitchers until Sandy Koufax tossed 11, and I guess it was 63. Hubble also established the consecutive scoreless innings streak of 45 1/3 until Drysdale came along again 3 decades later. Hubble, in July of 33, he tossed 3 1-0 victories. If you think about that, in 1 month he tossed 3 victories, 1-0. Most starting pitchers in their whole career aren't going to have 3 1-0 victories nowadays, and Hubble had 3 of them. That, by the way, tied a record by Dick Rudolph, who had 3 1-0 victories. And incidentally, Felix Hernandez in 2012, also tied that record. So only 3 pitchers have been able to do that. And perhaps his greatest 1-0 victory in July of 1933 happened on the Polo Grounds on July 2nd, 1933. Hubble, believe it or not, he pitched 18 scoreless innings. He won 1-0 in the first game of a doubleheader, and he defeated the St. Louis Cardinals that day. His opponent, Jesse Haynes, he pitched the first 14 innings. It was Tex Carlson who pitched the first 14 innings. Jesse Haynes took the loss. in relief for the Cardinals. And that was the first game of a doubleheader. The second game also was won by the Giants 1-0. Roy Parmalee, as I mentioned earlier, one of the 4 starting components of the Giants that year, he outdueled Dizzy Dean. So can you imagine that day, that July 2nd day in New York? You had Hubble 1-0 in 18 innings, and then you had Dizzy Dean losing the nightcap 1-0 in 9 innings. And one final note about that game, Gus Mancuso, the Giants catcher, he caught all 27 innings that day, believe it or not.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. And that really was the day that I write in my book that it was the Giants where they springboard into the league. They were already in first place, but that day finished a series where they took 4 out of 5 from the Cardinals, or 3 out of 5, I think it was. But it separated them from the rest of the league, which Pittsburgh, I think, was in second place at the time, and the Cardinals were jockeying for third or fourth there. And that was, to me, the pivotal point of the 33 season that day. It was a couple of days before the All-Star break, which wasn't really a break back then because they only took a day off. Half the teams in the league played, actually, the day before the All-Star game was played. But that game from then on, the Giants pretty much took control of the league, and they stayed in first place. They increased their lead, and they basically coasted to the pennant after that.
Now, even before we get to the All-Star game of that year, because that's huge, and one of the things I want to highlight is in 1934, Hubble set the record by striking out 5 future Hall of Famers in succession. Ruth, Garrick, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin. Now, on the 50th anniversary, so we're in 1984, of this performance, Fernando Valenzuela and Dwight Gooden combined to fan 6 batters in a row, which were Dave Winfield, Reggie Jackson, George Brett, by Valenzuela, Lance Parrish, Chet Lemon, and Alvin Davis by Gooden. It just shows you what a key pitcher Hubble was, and he did get into the Hall of Fame in 47, but this is even more eerie than anything else. Hubble died.
That was a tremendous achievement, you're right. And incidentally, that happened at the Polo Grounds. That was 34 at the Polo Grounds.
Right.
Yeah, an iconic moment in baseball history, definitely. All Hall of Famers.
Yeah, and now this is even more eerie than just that. What's even more eerie is that Hubble died. Well, he died an older man. He was, 85 years old when he died? He died to injuries due to an auto accident in Arizona. Now, he died in 1988. 30 years to the day that Mel Ott died of the same injuries. What's going on there? That's crazy.
Yeah, eerie coincidence. That's the best way to put it. You're right.
I mean, you do some research on these things. You're like, wow, look at all this stuff. Let's talk about the All-Star game. What's going on? They picked McGraw. Now McGraw's coming back to manage this one game. Is he overshadowing the success of the Giants' first half of the season? What's going on with the All-Star game?
No, I don't think so. I think that was actually a great PR move to have McGraw and Connie Mack manage the team. I think it was, really great because later on the managers of the pennant-winning teams from the year before ended up being managers, and since this was the first game, I don't know whose idea it was, but I think it was a pretty not only logical but pretty brilliant choice. Both of those guys being there. Of course, Mack was still managing at the time.
Mack managed, I think, until 1951 or 2, maybe 50 was his last season. He managed. He was on the team. He was on Philadelphia for 60 years. So, I mean, he managed for 50-something years. And, I like McGraw. He was a staple in the American League. He and McGraw pretty much were pioneers in the American League before, of course, like we spoke about, Van Johnson going to the National, McGraw going to the National League. But let me ask you this. In your research, did Babe Ruth point to the stands out there and say, look, I'm going to hit a home run? I think he was just trying to wipe mustard off his finger from the hot dogs he was eating, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, in the World Series, right? You're talking about from the year before.
Yeah, 1932.
Yeah, that's another one of those famous baseball moments. Although there may be more myth with your comment with the mustard, more myth associated to that than reality. There's photographs that he makes a gesture. There's actually a photograph, a grainy one, that there's a gesture being made, but who knows when that happened in the at-bat. It could have happened earlier in the at-bat or when he just first came up. It's just a great story, of course, and the Babe went with it afterwards. So there's no really way of saying. It's just one of those baseball lore type of things that really sounds great.
And you know something? When you look at Bill Terry's career, 1930 was probably the best year he had. He was on a slide, so now he takes over the team in 33. But what's ironic is, Ruth is still effective. I think 33 was his last. And then these baseball players, they fall off real quickly from their numbers. It's like in a few years, Bill Terry would lose his effectiveness as a player, and Ruth would be out by 1935 as well. I think what's his name in 1930, the player who had 181 RBIs, I forget his name. He went right down. Well, he had an alcoholic problem, but in those days, it's almost like you reach a peak, and then it's like a slow slide into oblivion, and then all of a sudden, it really veers off in the last few years of your career. What was going on with Bill Terry?
Yeah, well, just like anybody else, the age will always catch up to you. Back then, of course, there wasn't modern medicine or modern weightlifting equipment. Ball players didn't use weights back then, actually, but there just wasn't the science behind the medicine that could prolong a career. When you got hurt, it took a heck of a lot longer to get back, and it's just a combination of things. Terry actually came up late. He was in his mid-20s when he joined the Giants, and he didn't really become a starter until he was 1927 was his first year starting. Although in 1925, because of injury, he was the starting first baseman. But there's no question that this man was a Hall of Fame player. He had a 341 lifetime average. He played every single game. He just didn't miss games. And he just had 200 hit seasons galore. The only thing that you can criticize him for was he probably, for the era, didn't hit as many home runs as other first basemen did or other power hitters of the era. But I suspect that if he had tried to hit with more power, I think his batting average would have suffered, or at least he thought his batting average would have suffered. But you look at his slugging percentage, he double figures in triples, doubles, of course, was way up there. And as I mentioned, 200 hits just about every year. This man was a Hall of Famer and a very, very good manager.
Now, even before I get to Fitzsimmons, because I want to get to Fitzsimmons, but before anything, there's a Spanish influence here. Someone that interested you in the whole 1933 Giants. We got Adolfo Luque. Who's he and what was going on with him?
Yeah, Adolfo Luque, although Terry became my favorite player on the team after researching the team, or certainly the most fascinating player. He had such a great business acumen after he left the game and became so successful. But as you mentioned, what first attracted me to this team was Adolfo Luque, who was a relief pitcher on the Giants and who ended up winning the clinching game of the World Series, Game 5. And he did that at an age 43 where most players have long since retired. Luque was a Cuban-born pitcher. He was the first Hispanic star in the major leagues. His biggest claim to fame occurred in the 1920s with the Cincinnati Reds. In 1923, he had, in my opinion, the greatest season by a Hispanic hurler in Major League Baseball. He won 27 games, which to this day is still a record by a Hispanic pitcher in the major leagues. No one's been able to top that. You think of Pedro Martinez and Juan Marichal, pitchers like that, Felix Hernandez. that's still the record for most wins by a Hispanic player, pitcher in the major leagues. And he had just such a great year that year, and I've always been fascinated with his career, and I think this book is a culmination of the career that I've followed and been able to put down in print through my other books. And I think this book just adds a little bit more to his career and being able to bring it out to the public knowledge.
No, and you know something, you do a great job. And you know what? I'm still yet to read your book on Hispanic pitchers, but we're going to be having that broadcast, I think, in another month as well. But all these things, Juan Marichal is one of my favorite pitchers. And you know, a lot of people don't realize something. You know, they don't realize how great Marichal is. And again, he pitched for the San Francisco Giants. So we're still talking Giants baseball. What people don't realize about Marichal, he wasn't a three-pitch pitcher like Sandy Koufax. In his press, they're like, well, why aren't you striking out so many people, Juan? You know, he thought, again, Hispanics were, again, you know, being discriminated and all. He said, why do I need to throw three pitches when I could get a hit around with one pitch? A lot of ground balls with Juan Marichal. Plus that wonderful, wind-up that he had, almost like Satchel Paige, his legs going up right in the air. He's one of my favorite pitchers. And I think he won the most game in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, very good. He was the pitcher with the most victories in the entire decade. And as you mentioned, he had a very distinguishable leg kick. I mean, he brought his foot up to his nose before he pitched, of course, with no one on base. And he was one of the best pitchers. And you were talking about how he mastered several pitches. I read that he had 5 separate pitches that he mastered, and on top of that, he could throw them from different arm angles. So in effect, he had double digits in the ways he could throw a pitch. And one last thing about him, you mentioned eerie coincidences. 30 years, I should say, after Hubble beat the Cardinals 1-0 in that 18-inning game in the Polo Grounds. 30 years later, July 2nd, 1963, Marichal defeated Warren Spahn 1-0 in 16 innings. How do you like that?
Well, he was also 16 years younger than Spahn at the time. I remember Spahn was
the date. That was interesting.
There's a lot of coincidences with this 1930, with the Giants and all this stuff in the 1933 team. Let me ask you about Fitzsimmons. What was so special about him?
He was a veteran pitcher, and I think he and Hubble were the stabilizing forces. They certainly influenced the 2 younger pitchers in Hal Schumacher and Roy Parmalee. Fitzsimmons was a McGraw find in the minor leagues. Again, McGraw should be given credit for the pitching he left. Terry, although Schumacher and Parmalee were nowhere near as productive under McGraw as they were for this team, but Fitzsimmons was a great influence. He really went on to more fame later on with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was one of the team's favorite, more beloved players with the Dodgers. He was traded to the Dodgers a couple of years later, something he really hated, leaving the Giants, but it was one of those things where he later said that it was one of the best things that happened to him because the Brooklyn fans really embraced him.
And let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. Now the World Series is coming up, and again, Washington of all teams is there now. There's no big train there. There's Joe Cronin, who is, pretty much one of the youngest player managers in the league. When it was billed for the World Series, Giants are going back. We got Washington. They beat the Yankees. Who was favored to win this World Series?
Outside of New York, I think most people thought Washington would win. Washington actually won 6 or 7 more games than the Giants that year. They had the better record. But in New York, I think the Giants still were the betting favorite, and especially after they won the first game, I think basically everything tilted toward the Giants. But heading into the series, really it wasn't a sure thing that the Giants were going to win. It was a surprise, actually, much more for them to have won the pennant than Washington to have won the pennant.
And let me ask you this, because this is important. Now, we know that the Giants beat the Senators 4-1, but I don't even want to go into that. And this, my thing is, let's compare the tactics of Terry, who pretty much outmaneuvered Cronin during the whole series. Let's talk about some examples of what Terry did to get his team to win the series.
Yeah, I think anybody objectively who analyzes the series will say that Terry took advantage over. You mentioned Cronin's age over his inexperience. I think Cronin went too far with his starting pitchers in the series, where Terry would have been quick to pull his pitchers, although he had, of course, thoroughbreds in Hubble and Schumacher. But Terry made a key decision. The first game was won by Hubble, so Terry just went all the way with him. But the second game was won on a key pinch hit by Lefty O'Doul. I didn't mention Terry had picked up Lefty O'Doul during the season from the Brooklyn Dodgers in a trade for first baseman Sam Leslie. Leslie was actually playing first base for the Giants that year. We forgot to mention that Terry actually fractured a bone in his wrist 2 weeks into the season, and he was out for the better part of a month. He didn't return to the actual starting lineup until early June. So that was one thing about Terry. He managed the team from the bench without playing for a good five weeks of the year. But Sam Leslie, his understudy for many years, actually did a heck of a job, and it increased his trading value. And he was able to trade Leslie to the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers, who needed a first baseman desperately. And he picked up Lefty O'Doul, who in 1929 and 30 had some of the best hitting seasons that you're ever going to want to see in the major leagues. And O'Doul has a fabulous reputation as being one of the best hitters for a certain period of time in the major leagues. And he just so happened was having a sort of off year, or he wasn't producing up to his normal 300 average, and Terry was able to swing that deal. And O'Doul was a great fourth outfielder for the Giants coming down the stretch. He hit over 300 for the Giants that year, and as I said, with a pinch hit single with the bases loaded in Game 2, he won the second game of the World Series and really put the Giants in the driver's seat after that. They took a 2-0 commanding lead and headed to Washington, where they won 2 out of 3 games, including Luca's clincher in the 5th game. Luca pitched the last 4 2/3 innings of Game 5, which was won by a Mel Ott home run. Really a great way to end any World Series, although it was on the road. So the Washington had to bat in the bottom of the 10th.
And it's interesting about Lefty O'Doul, because I did a show on him, and I was trying to run the time, and I was going to mention him as people don't realize, and he's not in the Hall of Fame, Lefty O'Doul, which is just like Gil Hodges. It's just a tragedy, because I'm going to tell you why. He was the father of modern Japanese baseball. He actually, helped facilitate baseball within Japan. That when the war ended, when the Second World War ended, he was asked by MacArthur, and MacArthur asked no one. MacArthur's an island to himself, General MacArthur. He likes to stage himself. He fired one of his generals for giving an interview to Life magazine in the islands during the war, and without MacArthur's permission, he brought Lefty O'Doul to Japan to try to get the spirits up of the Japanese, who was just pummeled to the ground by American bombers throughout. But Lefty O'Doul, he was there. He was the second most well-known American besides MacArthur in Japan. That's how well-respected O'Doul was.
Yeah, I believe that he was baseball's, first great ambassador. And, as you mentioned, he was instrumental in the Yomiuri Giants taking up that nickname of Giants.
That's right.
And that team is, I guess, the most recognized team in Japan, and the equivalent, I guess, of the New York Yankees of Japan.
And it's a shame for Odul because he lived in San Francisco, grew up there. He's in the San Francisco Bay Area Sports Hall of Fame. He was inducted there in 1981, the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame in 2002, and as you mentioned, he has the highest career batting average of any player right now eligible for the National Baseball Hall of Fame that's not enshrined. That's the effect of having a lefty Odul on your team, and the Giants did. Let me ask you this question: when you make a parallel throughout history, the '54 Giants were probably the most surprising team to ever win the World Series. They're coming up against the Cleveland team, who won 111 games. This harps back also to the 1906 World Series between the White Sox and the Cubs. And the Cubs, won also that year 116 games, but yet they lost to the White Sox in the World Series. The Giants beat the Indians in the World Series 55. The Dodgers overthrew my Yankees, and both the Giants and the Dodgers would be on their way out of New York in 1957, at the end of 57, for the 58 season. But this 1933 team, this team that Terry remarkably put together would last well into the late 30s. Do you think that the 33 Giants is one of the best Giants team ever?
Yes, I definitely do. I mean, especially when you look at the starting four. I don't think, even though the Giants went to the World Series in 36 and 37 with Terry as manager, I don't think they had that frontline pitching that they did in the 33 team. I definitely think this was their best team, certainly under the Terry years. And maybe I'm thinking how they would have matched up against the 54 team. I think maybe they'd be better again because of the pitching.
Yeah, I mean, they had some great pitching, 4 good starters who can, be an ace on any team. They had my man Mel Ott. They had Bill Terry. They had Lefty. They had a few other key players, and they had, of course, they had Adolfo over there, Luque, and it's just a great team. Let me ask you something. I could just talk to you about another hour about, time's running. Is there anything that I didn't mention that maybe you would want to mention about this team?
I think it reflects Terry, the virtue he brought, something I said earlier about he just brought a more calming atmosphere to the team. Especially, it was such a big contrast to McGraw, who really ruled with an iron fist and had a reputation for really reaming his players if they didn't perform on the field. Terry was not like that, and in fact, that was one of the reasons Terry and McGraw didn't get along. Terry thought some of McGraw's criticism was unfounded or too knee-jerk a type of reaction. I think that was a flaw of McGraw. He would be too quick to criticize a player, although he mostly always did it in the clubhouse, away from the reporters. All this about McGraw didn't come out until the players were actually traded, or until he traded the players, and then he was not adverse. McGraw was not adverse to criticizing them.
But I'll tell you this much about McGraw: he was definitely gruff. He was definitely not the most likable guy. But I know in your book when it comes out, the guy was a genius, and not only that, but also about McGraw, because there's so much negativity about McGraw. When he saw something in a player, and a player could be fixed, like Merkel. Merkel made that bonehead play, but yet Merkel went on to have a good career, and McGraw defended him. And he saw something. If McGraw saw you, that you worked hard and that you aligned with his line of thinking and his what a player should do, he kept with you. And I think Casey Stengel is another one, because he said, look, Casey, you're getting older. Why don't you sit on the bench with me? And, you can learn from the bench. And basically, Casey Stengel did the same kind of McGrawian, kind of style of play with the Yankees in the 50s. And if you want to even go further, McGraw's influence goes well into the 70s under Billy Martin because, Billy Martin was Casey Stengel's boy. So people have to understand the importance of McGraw. People have to understand that 1933, this giant of a man is now gone, and this team wins the World Series and shocks everyone. So to me, that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, that's true. Terry had incredibly big shoes to fill, and that's really an astute point you mentioned about McGraw. He was a great recognizer of talent. As I said, he left Terry with the 4 starting pitchers. He also picked up Adolfo Luca the year before, who had been released by the Brooklyn Dodgers. He also signed Hyde Bell, which we didn't mention. Hyde Bell, he actually led the team in saves. He was tied with Carl Hubble with 5 saves on the year. Again, that shows you what kind of season Hubble had. He also was tied for the team lead in saves. But McGraw picked up Hyde Bell and Luca, and of course left the 4 starting pitchers, Barmeli, Fitzsimmons, Schumacher, and Hubble for Terry. He was a great recognizer of talent. That is probably how I characterize McGraw best as far as living up to the reputation he earned.
And he did. And you know what? We're going to get you on the show next month for the great Latin players, pitchers on the show. We'll also get you on the show in the new year with McGraw and a couple of other books that I want to get from you. So hold the line. This is how I end the show. Folks, go out and get this book. I had such a great time speaking here with Lou today. I hope you had a great time too, Lou. I told you time's going to go fast.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, Ian. I appreciate your interest.
Oh, it's great. It's great to have you. Just hold the line. Folks, go out, get this book. It's published by McFarland. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Nobles. Where else can we find it? Do you have a website or something, Lou?
I don't have a website, but you can try the McFarland publishing website. But Amazon really has really good deals for books, as most people know.
It's a fascinating read. It's a fascinating with culture and the time period. And it's, besides baseball, it's a history book. You get to learn something that maybe you didn't know. I didn't know a few things out of here, but you get it. And, of course, that's what my show is all about, is learning. And we learned a lot about the 33 Giants today. And as for all you folks, hey, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. I had a great time today. I'm in for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Thank you, Lou, for being on the show. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, folks, good night, good luck. We'll see you next time.